I'm Cathal Summers,
And I'm Deirdre Glynn,
your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors, and you're welcome to the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, bringing you the latest information, science and opinion to improve farm sustainability.
On this episode, Kerry man Tommy Heffernan, also known as Tommy the Vet, a veterinary consultant based in Wicklow, joins us to talk about water quality, the sometimes forgotten nutrient. Do you have stock drinking directly from streams or rivers? And if so, what effect is this having on animal health and performance? Cow signals. What signs should we look out for in our animals to make sure they're in good health in order to maintain a high level of performance, in particular in relation to water?
Pathogens. What potentially are our animals consuming when drinking directly from a stream? And also, what are they putting back into the river? With pica on the rise on some farms, would multi-species swards have a role to play in solving mineral deficiencies and improving rumen health on farms? Tommy, welcome to the show. First thing I suppose, just to ask you, can you tell us a bit about your journey as in veterinary medicine, and maybe suppose from practice vet to educator, and maybe influencer, if I could use that question or that word?
A little bit uncomfortable with that. Thanks very much, Cathal and Deirdre, for having me on, and well done on the podcast. Yeah, look, I've had an interesting journey. It sounds like the American phrase when you talk about going through life as a journey, but yeah, I've been in vet practice for 16 years, general practice here in Wicklow. Was a partner for 10 years at that. Ups and downs of practice was not easy. And for the last 3.5 years, I've been working as a consultant, doing various roles. And I suppose, yeah, I'm in the education space a lot now. My traditional veterinary work maybe is going down all the time, but lots of experience. And I suppose those experiences are, and particularly failures, have been big learnings for me and sort of keep me grounded on kind of when I am educating people, understanding the realities of how hard life can be. Because certainly when you're in the education space and you talk about the wonderful things, the way the world should be, you can often become detached from the realities of how difficult maybe even farming can be at times. So I try and keep myself grounded and remember my own failures along the way.
Yeah, I think that's important. If you're not on the farm every now and again, it's very hard. And I know you mentioned this before. We started the show is that, you know, if you're on the ground, you can see the realities and the hardships that farmers have to deal with. Lots of different things. Health just been one of them, and we're from the environmental side, so it's a big juggling act. They're looking at finances, they're looking at prices, all the other stuff as well. So there's a lot to deal with.
There's huge amount. And see the weather. I mean, look at the struggles now. I get to talk to a lot of farmers. Grass growth has stalled. And you know, just another difficult stress and challenge on top of everything else. And I'm very, very conscious as well. And I know we're on an environmental podcast, incredibly important subject, probably the subject of the next decade, not just in farming. But, you know, I think people need to be mindful of how difficult farming is, and that, yes, we will get there on some of the environmental challenges, and we're making massive progress, but there's a lot of pressure. So that negative stuff that farmers hear at difficult times, people shouldn't underestimate the impact that has on people on the ground.
Yeah, and you've just set it up nicely there first for the next question. At the moment, we've had very little rain in certainly in the southeast of the country for the last month or so. Growth rates are very, very poor at the moment. There's a lot of hay being made at the moment, actually, but the soil moisture deficit around the southeast, particularly in Wexford, Kilkenny, up those parts, up into Dublin, Wicklow, is between 50 and 60 at the moment. So we're getting close to drought conditions. So we're talking about water, water quality in relation to animal health and also environment. But you've described in the past that as water has been sometimes the forgotten nutrient. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, so certainly when I qualified and spent a lot of time in looking at the science, got very conscious about diseases and specific diseases and how they work. But I sort of have found myself over my career going back to really the biological needs of the animal, understanding what are the basic things we really need to get right. Okay, feeding, space, and hygiene. But water is one of those critical elements for animal health, any animals, ourselves. And if we think about our ruminants in particular, okay, right down to a cell level water is important, but we're not often feeding the cows, we're feeding the bugs in the rumen. That rumen is so important. It's a big fermentation vat. So clean, available water is so vital for our ruminants. And I suppose now when I really emphasize this, because when temperatures are increasing for cows, they're actually quite prone to heat stress. Over 21 degrees, they come under a bit of pressure, so they're going to consume more water. So if it's such a critical element, we need to focus on it. And it's something that's, for some reason or another, it's overlooked, because maybe, look, a lot of the elements we put into farming, they have a commercial value, and that drives a lot of information around certain areas, be it minerals or vaccines or whatever it might be. But there's not a huge commercial angle to water, so we tend to leave it, maybe forget about it at times.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point you made, because I suppose farmers always, you're talking about cows come under stress, or beef or stock, whatever stock you have. And look, if what I'd be worried about sometimes from the environmental side is we're trying to maybe get animals out of rivers, because if the animal's in the river, it's putting pressures on the rivers, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on maybe. But I suppose it also affects the production side. If the water's not maybe clean enough, or if there's issues with water, or maybe if they're not getting enough water, or they have to travel too far from water, it can affect maybe the bulk tank or maybe the beef production. So I suppose you talk a bit about cow signals, Tommy. And what kind of signs would we look out for, maybe animals or cow signals that, or cattle signals that there might be an issue with an animal in relation to water, or lack of water even?
Well, the obvious ones that you'll see with a sick animal is their actual eye position, whether it be calves or cows. Is obviously a great way of looking at dehydration. So if the eyes are starting to sink back in the head, the coat condition itself, when animals are drinking lots of water, coat condition, that shine on the coat. I know it's a very general term, but those simple things, skin tint can be used where you pull out skin and you watch how quickly it flicks back. But people who are used to looking at stock will know, they talk about it. I'm from Kerry, talking about a shine off animals. And when you have less water, you're going to affect everything to do with that animal. And the problem with, there's a couple of problems, obviously, with, water sources, be it streams or rivers, is you cannot control that inputs. And water has a massive impact in production. And just last week, I'm involved in 2 farms, and we have these little boluses in cows that measure water intakes, and we got all these water intakes alerts last week, and the cows were in a field where there was a problem with the trough, and that day there's 45 cows going into the tank. The litres were back by 150 litres that day. So that was a very visual, and I said to the guys, we've got to be keeping an eye on water, because there you are, look, there's, like, most of the other inputs are the same, and I've no doubt that the water was the main reason there. So yeah, we want clean, available water, and we need to be able to control that. So trough size is really important, flow rate, all those sort of things. And when you're going into a stream or a river, and looking at that, is, of course, there's huge issues, but from an animal health and production perspective, we really aren't providing the cows properly with adequate amounts of water.
I'm glad that the bolus numbers are adding up there as well, that there's an issue with the bulk tank, because I've been talking to farmers about this a lot. Like I said before, I always come, I suppose, a 2-fork approach. If cows have a good setup, a good system in place for troughs and lots of water, keep them out of the river, you're solving environmental issues and you're solving production issues. So that's a really good point. The other thing I wanted to ask you, Tommy, was just cows walking in and out of rivers. You have wet areas, and sometimes when you're onto rivers, there's high water tables, there's a lot of water around it. Is there issues maybe around liver fluke and foot rot? And even on the farms I've come across where I've seen a lot of badger sets on banks of rivers, and I'd be a little bit worried about what would be going on in that water, maybe upstream of where cows or cattle are drinking.
Yeah, again, we just can't control it. We don't know. And all those things are risks that can be very farm specific, certainly from a wildlife perspective. Certainly when you've, like, cows are they tend to, like, you will see from the National Geographic, from the buffaloes, that they tend to drink together and come out. They're a herd species. So, you get a lot of trampling, a lot of dirt, and a lot of environmental conditions where the feces and the water and the mucky conditions, it's a real disease risk area. Okay. Plus we don't know what's in the water. And plus, of course, fluke are certainly, particularly from September onwards, they're the types of conditions those parasites like. And I know for many years now, the fluke control, we talk about fencing off wet areas at risk times to reduce fluke, because flukes are massively important economic disease and health disease for cows. So there's so much risk with it. And it's, I suppose, again, when you're there and you're doing something for years and you can't see these things, it's hard to explain it, but there's on so many levels, Cathal. There's disease risk, we don't know about production issues, and certainly waterborne diseases we could be looking at. And of course, from the environmental perspective, we just don't want cows in there as well. It's chicken and egg. There's two challenges, but from a production and a disease point of view, you're better off fencing off those waterways, wet areas, because again, you don't want the foot to be in damp conditions, because that's where martellaro and other diseases can potentially spread.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of farmers are familiar with that kind of stuff, but tell me a little bit, you mentioned a little bit about bacteria and stuff in the room, and tell me a little bit about pathogens and maybe some of the issues that arise from pathogens in rivers, or maybe even you've mentioned before the show about maybe actually animals putting them back into the river.
So when you look at pathogens in water, there's no doubt about it that they can be in, and it's not just rivers or lakes, it can be in our own water systems within farms. So we need to really focus on clean, health, available water. So when you look at, there's lots of bacterial pathogens that like water sources, and if we look at potentially some of the ones, like, I mean, there's different risk levels. If we look at even maybe, and it's a risk both ways, if you look at antibiotic resistance, one of the challenges we talk about is One Health, and that the animals and humans, we're sharing the same environment. So when humans, which can be a big source of resistant bacteria, or animals are sharing waterways, that's a risk of transfer. So I think there's lots of diseases. I mean, to list off the waterborne diseases we could be worried about, I mean, we could be here for a while, but it's just to know that clean, available water is something we can control within the farm. When we get into the river, that's a thing we probably lose in control, because we don't know what's going on upstream.
Yeah, and I suppose the ones that we'd be common that we'd hear about, maybe it's like Seleptor, Cryptor, Scours, Mastitis, and like you said, there could be any list of them. But they're ones that farmers are worried, and we're talking about production, but they can also give fertility issues and that kind of stuff as well, Tommy, can they?
They can, yeah. So Listeria can be waterborne. Cryptosporidium is a real challenge because okay, people think about cryptosporidium in calves, okay, and that's when we're going to see the clinical symptoms, but the source of that cryptosporidium that keeps it going year on farm, and I'm doing some interesting work on that at the moment, looking at crypto in different places, but the cow is the source. So on farms, when we've looked at crypto, we've looked at the cow dung just to see very small levels, but it's the initial source for the challenge. So yeah, I think we've just got to be mindful. Actually, mastitis pathogens, I've seen it on our own farm. Now, this is not in rivers or anything, this is in our own water troughs where we've had poor water quality. I've picked up E. coli's, I've picked up, actually, again, I have to stress, it's not a research farm, this is just my own observations, because I culture a lot of bacteria and I'm interested in it. It's by no means scientific research or peer reviewed, but I picked up Strep uberis in water, which is a pathogen a lot of farmers will know about, because it's one of the predominant mastitis pathogens we see now, particularly during breeding time, because cows, when they come into heat, have an increase in estromet. That estromet actually reduces down immunity in the udder, and we see a lot of clinical mastitis during breeding. And the common pathogen we see is Strep uberis, and that's dangerous because it can go from a clinical mastitis to being transferred in the milking parlour, causing cell count issues. So yeah, there's a lot of things that water, unfortunately, water is huge positives now. We're really painting water in a bad light here, but there is risks around pathogens when it comes to water.
Yeah, no, and I think, look, you've made a really important point. Probably sent shivers up the spines of farmers in the last 5 minutes of our conversation, but I think the reality situation is the important thing is to make sure our animals get clean water, and we should do everything in our power to achieve that, and not just clean water, but enough water as well. So that's vitally important.
Enough is such an important thing. Clean, available water, it is the forgotten nutrient, and you'll see it production wise when it's looked after. And there's so many elements then within water. We're mentioning microbes, or we're mentioning bacteria, but you look at, sulfur, iron, other things that can be in water that can affect mineral uptake. So there's quite a bit. And one thing I would really encourage farmers to do is test water to see what the elements that are the inorganic elements that are in there. Look at maybe pathogens pathogens that might be in water supplies and talk about that. And again, I like people to tissue test grass so we know sort of what's there and what's going into our animals from a mineral perspective, because it gives us a better idea. Because we're very good at putting out buckets and bolusing and everything like that, but we often don't see what's actually there. And water quality is something I think maybe every 2 years farms should be testing, and I know they're doing it through co-ops anyway, but it's an important thing to test.
I suppose, Tommy, from this conversation, we're kind of coming to the conclusion that cattle are very, very sensitive to decreasing water quality or good water quality. Have you come across any issues with animals and contaminated wells? Or are individuals testing enough, do you think, or are they even aware of the issue with water quality and well sources?
I think it's probably not been on radars. Again, I think the conversation we're like this is we're all ever evolving. So we're all like, I mean, we're having a discussion about it today. So we're all part of that education piece. I don't think there's enough maybe thought put into, because it's obviously farm wells. What is the water quality in the well like? And it's very interesting because I do a lot of mastitis work, where we look at environmental pathogens. And these are cause a lot of clinical mastitis. And okay, a lot of them come from cow feces and hygiene, but part of that process now has become looking at water sources, because if we've got a lot of environmental pathogens in water, they make their way into the rumen, the digestive system, and they make their way out onto the ground where the cows and others are going to be lying. So I think, we need to get better at probably looking at water quality issues on farm, knowing what the water is like, but then a real focus inside the farm on what affects good quality water, which is flow rate, available trough size, all those sort of things, and actually looking into water troughs and seeing, what's the water like. And okay, people will say, sure, a cow's a cow, they're fairly hardy, they're going to drink anything, but that's not sort of where we want to go when we want to maximize production and health.
Tommy, where water quality is good, could there be an issue with palatability and water? The way you could have like sulfates, magnesium levels, phosphate levels, they might be at an acceptable level, but where does it become unpalatable to the animal, even when the quality is seen to be good?
Yeah, so if we take away the pathogens and the bugs that we might be looking at, there are certainly elements in water that will make it unpalatable. Sulfur is one, but you'll smell that sulfur, that rotten egg type smell. That's something you'd worry about. Sometimes very high iron will have issues around palatability as well. And they're once a smell thing you'll see, some farms who've had sulfur issues will know, because they'll have that smell around waterways, particularly in around the milking parlour. Again, with iron, you'll see it in your pipes and stuff like that. Both those elements, can affect palatability of water, but they've quite big consequences inside because of their interactions with other minerals, particularly locking up copper, and high levels of sulfur aren't great for the cow's rumen itself. So I suppose they are some of the obvious elements. When it comes to phosphates and other things like that, I wouldn't have any sort of experience there, but how do we measure water intakes is a challenge. Now, I've been lucky that I've worked with different companies with different systems that track water behavior and water consumption, so we can see it. But I think just be aware of the obvious things around water consumption. So smell and tainting and iron. So they're very obvious ones. You can see it's the smell of sulfur and the iron staining you'll see in parlours in waterways.
Brilliant. So Cathal and I are both ASAP advisors, so we're working on that. And we're seeing the science in some of the river bodies with elevated nitrate levels. So the pH of water obviously can impact on animal health. It can become a stressor, I suppose, if it goes below pH 5.5. With nitrates entering water sources, could this become more of an issue in the future, do you think, Tommy?
It's a good question, and probably beyond my expertise, to be honest with you. My own opinion would be it's not where we want to be, particularly from, I suppose, a rumen health perspective. When we think of the rumen and where the pH of the rumen should be, it's mildly alkalotic pre-calving, mildly acidotic mildly now post-calving. We don't really want to be driving down the rumen pH. Now, it would have to go pretty low in water to affect it. But if we do that, we affect the microflora in the rumen, and that's what we're feeding in the cow. We often think we're feeding the cow, we're feeding the bugs in the rumen. So good water quality, the right pH, all those fine balances like fiber has a huge impact. So the answer is I don't know, but from, I suppose, basic science would tell me nitrates and lower pH is not where we want to be around water.
Exactly, yeah. On one of your vlogs, you raised the issue of pica. With some farmers not doing herbage analysis and not really knowing what the mineral content is in a monoculture, for example, and it can be a challenge. Do you see a role going forward for multi-species grasses and animal health?
I absolutely do. I'm a huge fan of multi-species, but the problem is for me, I'm not the person trying to sow it and get the persistency right, which is a challenge. But I would be very, very excited about multi-species swards on a couple of levels. On the animal health level, from a rumen perspective, I think from what I'm seeing from farmers I'm engaging with, it's really, really positive. Again, because back to that rumen health, the diversity of bugs in the rumen, the diversity of sward types, fiber, all those sort of things, minerals, really, really good. And I think from a root structure point of view, particularly if we look at pica, I saw pica for the first time 12 years ago. I'll never forget it because I hadn't a clue what I was really looking at. And cows eating stones. And I've seen it exponentially increase over the years. I mean, this year, I quite a lot of farms struggle with pica, and early on it was phosphorus. Now I looked at, okay, colder temperatures can affect phosphorus, but why are we seeing more pica? That's the question I think we need to look at. And I think from what I'm seeing with minerals and particularly root structure, soil, the rhizosphere of the plant, I think all those things will benefit, particularly mineral absorption and soil health, because a lot of the P is there. It's just not been uptaken by the plant. And certainly with monocultures, they're fantastic from an efficiency point of view, and they're great to have, but they do physiologically have challenges around mineral absorption. And I've seen that, and I've seen minerals, I've been tracking mineral analysis for 12 years now on silages, and I see them declining. So that's the question. I think we need to do more research on it. And because again, it's easy for someone like me to say, oh, look, we all need to be engaging with mixed species swards, but there is its challenges. But I would say from an animal health perspective, I'd be very excited about the potential of mixed species swards.
I think they're also finding that, some of the research coming from Tommy Boland and Helen Sheridan, you're seeing reduced anthelmintic use in some of these swards as well. That's one of the benefits of it as well. Okay, so we look at, you've done some work on oxygenation levels in water, and BOD and eutrophication obviously affect oxygenation levels. Can you tell us a little bit about issues that you've come across with oxygen levels in water, or low oxygen levels in water, and how do you think could we remedy this going forward?
Yeah, it sounds more impressive than it is, Deirdre, because I suppose on our farm, and this is I learned, I'm always learning. I mean, on our farm, we're very lucky to have animal health monitoring systems, which is a rumen bolus, which measures a load of parameters. But one of the things is it's very sensitive to temperature. So every time a cow drinks, the bolus temperature drops and we can watch water intake. So it creates alerts based on algorithms. So on one of our farms, we were continuously getting alerts on water. And there I was talking about water, and there we had the problem. So first thing was to look at the amount of water, and we certainly didn't have enough troughs. So we put in more troughs and the water alerts didn't go down. So I'm very lucky, I suppose, to work with a lot of people in different areas of agriculture with expertise. And John Paul Innes, a good friend of mine, had a little oxygen probe, and he could measure it. Now, in fairness to the naked eye, as we moved through our system of water troughs, you could see the deterioration in it. But we were measuring oxygen levels because the more stagnant and lower quality, the less oxygen. So the probe was getting lower and lower as we moved away from the source of our well, down to 0.5% in the last trough. Now, the naked eye would tell you was pretty poor, and they were the troughs that I cultured a lot of environmental pathogens. So I suppose what we did was we looked at flow rates, because flow rate will oxygenate water. Water pressure is really important. And we were trialing some oxidizing agents in the water. And when we did that, as soon as we switched on the oxidizing agent, the water intake alert stopped. So we controlled that. And it was really interesting for me, because I was always about the space, the amount of troughs, but I didn't spend enough time looking at the quality itself. And look, it could be pretty straightforward. It's a flow issue, because the more flow you have in water, and some people will see fish, for example, we put into water troughs, which seems very, but again, what are fish doing? They're cleaning, and they're taking out a lot of the anaerobic material and algae, and they're keeping that water clean. So really interesting, and I've seen that firsthand, and I suppose that's the beauty of the monitoring system, is you see it, the problem is there, and you create a solution and it goes away. And that's what has fascinated me about animal health monitoring systems, is the information they're giving us about the cow that I probably didn't even think about.
The unfortunate thing there, I suppose, is not every farm has those monitors. But what we would come across, I suppose, from the water quality side, 50% of our rivers are not quite up to the stat we want them at. So even before you get to that trough situation where you extract the water out, potentially some of the rivers are low in oxygen anyway. And we have to get back to that root cause where we get the quality up, so that the biological oxygen demand is not as high, and that we have better oxygenated water before it even comes into the tank system.
Yeah, and again, I think, and I'm not an expert, Cathal, and would like your opinion on this. So try to do a bit of research on it, and looking at what, from a quality point of view, oxygen is really important in water, but it plays a really important role when we look at it in an oxidative capacity in the gut. So we talk about bad pathogens and good pathogens. I'm fascinated with the microbiome. We're trying to feed good bacteria in our systems and our cells and in animals, and having that extra oxygen in water is really, really important. Why, my question, I'm turning around, why are we seeing low oxygen levels in our rivers, for example?
Yeah, and a lot of the issue is if you have, say, maybe organic matter getting in, or you're getting lots of algae, it's taking that oxygen from the river. So what we're really trying to get back to, if we can get our status up, if we can reduce the amount of, I suppose, organic matter getting in, maybe if some slurry gets washed in, or whatever else might make it washed in, reduce the amount of algae in the rivers as well, that will bring back to lots of invertebrates. It'll bring rivers or fish back into rivers. So we'll look at those less sediment, nice clean pebbles on the rivers, and that'll give us produce much more oxygenated water when it gets into those tank systems. But going back to the point we made earlier on, I suppose, if we keep putting maybe, well, there's lots of different issues, but cattle walking into the river is just one of I suppose, death by 1,000 cuts. But it's just one of those things we can do to improve that. And like Deirdre said, again, we have phosphorus issues and nitrate issues, but there's lots of things to solve, but a lot of good work has been done on it. And continues to be done. And I suppose Deirdre mentioned the asset program, and we can see in some of the areas we're working in that there is improvements already in the last number of years, which is very positive.
And also, I suppose, irrigation farmers currently, a lot of them are required to move their water troughs away from the river. You have a 20-metre buffer between where the water trough is located and the river is. I suppose water trough management, do we put enough emphasis on it in terms of design and the location of where the troughs are for animal health, do you think, Tommy?
Massive one. So we can talk about clean water, but available water, but the cows have to get at it, okay?
Yeah.
And so versus herd size versus where you put it, you talk about poaching and free draining soil, like positioning of the water trough, having enough space around it, particularly as our herds get bigger, that your less dominant animals can get in and drink water. And then having plenty good flow rate there. Even like, and I saw it only recently on a trough that was way too high, and the cows can't see this in the podcast, now we're doing this on Zoom, but the cows were stretching their necks in over the water trough. Like they were physically pressing in. So the height of our troughs, the space around it, where we position around, particularly poaching, maybe in higher areas. I know that can be an issue for water pressure, but it's massive. And indoors, it's really a problem. Those quick small bowls that the cow can just put her muzzle into, a couple of them, so particularly in beef finishing units, I see these small bowls. And okay, flow rate can be okay, but if you look at the natural cycle of how a cow drinks water, she laps with her tongue. She needs a certain depth of water. She needs to get at it. And if it's in a position where she's struggling and fighting to get in there, she'll prefer to stay back and not drink that water. So it's really, really simple, but really important to get right.
Another thing I suppose that we're trying to do in our job as well as ASAP advisors is where we're finding the pressure on the river body is drinking point access or phosphate or bank encroachment. We're trying to encourage farmers to put in solar pumps and nose pumps just to get them out of the water body. But I suppose some of them are finding, especially beef farmers, are finding the cost of it prohibitive at the moment, you know. So we are trying to encourage farmers to try and get, use this technology to get them out of the water courses.
Just on that truck management, Tommy, like it's a job that people don't like at the start of the year, going out, cleaning out trucks, making sure it's nice and clean and scrubbed. What we used to do years ago, and now it's been a while since I was on a farm, working properly on a farm, but we used to go around, and if time was a little bit against us, we'd get a handful of rhino lime and throw it into the trucks, and all the dirt that was in the trucks would settle at the bottom. Is that a bad thing or a good thing, do you know?
I look, I would have heard that before. I wouldn't be, what I've started doing and saying to people is using hydrogen peroxide actually, because it's actually a very good disinfectant. If you look at intensive livestock systems, it's very interesting because biofilms and animals are indoors all the time. They're using a lot of hydrogen peroxide in their waterways to keep it clean. And, people talk about hydrogen peroxide as, oh God, why would you put that? But if you think of it elementally, it's H2O2. So when you often put it in, a free oxygen radical goes in. So it's a wonderful biorational cleaning agent. So it's something that I'm recommending at the moment for cleaning water troughs, because it's not going to do any harm to the environment. At the right concentrations, it's quite safe. And it's interesting you mentioned algae, because our worst water troughs with our lowest oxygenation obviously had the most algal bloom in them. So, they had the most growth. So getting in there and actually scrubbing them out, it's not a nice job. And people, I'd say, will be, if they're not switched off now, they say, this man's going to make our life an incredibly difficult job. But that attention to detail will pay. I promise farmers that if you can get the element of water right, cows will pay you back in production and health. I've no doubt about it. And it is that attention to detail on that simple element of water that really can pay.
So anyone that was doing a bit of home bleaching over COVID will have a bit of hydrogen peroxide in the press anyway to clean out the trucks.
It's a very interesting element, hydrogen peroxide, when you look at it from a cleaning perspective. And, I read a good bit of studies on different farming systems to kind of get an idea of what's happening. And it's really become incredibly popular in intensive systems to get rid of biofilm and to improve water quality. And what you see, and it's 30 parts per million or 20 parts per million. It's really small amounts, but it's an incredibly effective agent at doing that. And it's no harm at that level to certainly the animals or humans. It's actually a biorational product. And I think it'll be something of increasing popularity as we go forward and we look at options around water quality potentially on farm. But yeah, no, I think getting clean water, I know I'm probably repeating myself, really for the cow's sake, and making sure she's plenty access. And where the particular pinch points I see, and I know we're talking about rivers and streams and outside, is inside. Particularly when cows are in houses and rows of cubicles, we don't have enough water stations and space around them. And if you actually spend a bit of time watching cows, particularly our heifers will suffer, our less dominant cows, where a dominant bully cow can actually stand beside the water, and she'll could be standing there for an hour, and you just have a queue around her, they won't go near her. So having space around water troughs and having enough of them, certainly if you're building sheds, is one of the key things. And I was on a farm yesterday, and we were looking at another issue, but he was halfway through a build, and I pushed and put another water trough in there. He was giving out to me, but we had that discussion. It's really, really important from the cow perspective.
So I suppose from your vlogs, I can see that you have a massive love of poetry and you're quoting quite freely from Seamus Healy. And also you had a lovely quote from George Bernard Shaw, the harder I work, the more I live. And I suppose you're certainly taking this ethos seriously in your work as in veterinary and also as an educator. So I'd like to wish you the very, very best of good luck in your future. And thank you for joining us today, Tommy.
Thank you, Deirdre, and thank you, Cathal. Great chat. And look, it's great to have these conversations. I think, look, we face lots of challenges, but I think let's focus on solutions. We've got so many of them there. And the big thing for me is, and look, we all see it in our own lives, is not to be getting too poetic on you, but fear. People fear change, and that's a reality. And when you talk about moving animals out of rivers and streams, it's something you've been doing for years. It takes time, but discussions like these and podcasts like yourselves help people understand why we need to do it. Won't happen overnight, but I think it's really important. So well done to both of you. Really enjoyed the catch up.
Thanks a million, Tommy, and keep up the great work.
That's it for this episode of the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast. Thanks to Tommy Heffernan, veterinary consultant and educator based in Wicklow, for joining us on the show.
Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glynn.
Join us next time for the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, signpost to farm sustainability.